Hi everyone, my name is Tim Edwards. I'm the President of Economics, Finance and Management Society, and I'm delighted to be speaking with Rachana Shanbhogue, Finance Editor of The Economist. Rachana has had a career spanning both the public and private sector. She has a master's in economics from the University of Cambridge and started out her career at the Bank of England. She then worked for the House of Commons before returning to the Bank of England, where she authored highly influential reports on financial stability and inflation for the Monetary Policy Committee. She's currently the finance editor of The Economist, which I'm sure you're aware is one of the top sources of journalism in the world. Rachana, it's fantastic to have you here.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm delighted to be here.
So to kick things off, can you tell us how you got to where you are today and how your career's progressed?
Well, sure. Where to start? So I ended up doing economics at university, really sort of as a compromise with my dad, who really, Indian parents, at least my parents were a bit like this. They really wanted me to do engineering. I really wanted to do to study English literature, and we sort of ended up compromising on economics. Despite that, I really enjoyed my undergraduate degree to the extent that I stayed on to do a master's. And at that point, once I did the master's, I started thinking about, where I wanted to work. And the parts of economics that really appealed to me, I think, were development economics and macroeconomics. And it was the sort of problem-solving side of it, the realization that economics could actually affect people's lives and potentially improve them. So I ended up applying to work as a new graduate at the Bank of England, and I have to say, it was a fantastic experience for a whole load of reasons. I joined with about 40 other graduates, so it was a little bit like Freshers' Week all over again. And more importantly and more seriously, actually, the financial crisis had just struck. I think I joined a fortnight after Lehman Brothers went down, and I was in the economics area covering the labour market, and so we were seeing unemployment rising and so on, but the pace was still slower than if I'd been in the markets department, for example, where things were much more frenetic. We were looking at the data, sort of trying to understand why unemployment hadn't risen as much as we expected. All these concepts that I learned at university suddenly being put to use. A real sort of opportunity to think analytically about what was happening, to work with some great economists. So that's what I did at the bank, and then I went on to cover Asian economies and sort of analyse what developments in China and India meant for inflation in the UK. And at that point, that was about 4 years into working at the bank, I thought, I need to try something else. I need to try something different. And so I ended up moving over, as you mentioned, to Parliament, where I worked for an MP. Specifically, I worked for Liam Byrne, who was at the time the Shadow Work and Pensions Secretary. And I think I was sort of maybe a bit idealistic and wanted to help shape, Labour's policy on welfare. I did that for a couple of years, and I would say that the experience wasn't really for me. I think I'm more suited to being a sort of a dry analytical person than a political person. It was interesting, and it's very entrepreneurial. You're sort of working for a very small office, about 5 of you, together with the MP, kind of advising him, and it's long hours and kind of exhilarating when there's legislation going through Parliament. But I wouldn't say I was really using economics that much in the job. And so I ended up going back to the bank, and that's when I really started getting experience of writing, communicating in economics. And like, as you mentioned, I worked for a couple of years on the inflation report. I think it's now called the Monetary Policy Report, or it's been rebranded in some way. And that was really interesting. I have to say, that was sort of that was taking the technical stuff that I knew and trying to explain it to people who weren't so close to the subject. And it was at a time, I remember still, it was around the time of Brexit. So I remember coming in the day after the referendum, no idea what was going on. David Cameron had resigned, coming in, sort of stunned silence in the office, and a speech being given by the head of the economics department on, how we'd carry on doing what we were doing. It was a bit of a shock, and then sort of helping to explain the actions that the Bank of England took shortly thereafter, with the lending scheme and so on. And that got me really interested, I think, in writing. And once you sort of get that interest, you want to experience writing not just about monetary policy, not just about financial stability, which I then went on to do, but also about a whole load of economic concepts. And I sort of, after 2-3 years of working in the communications area, I asked my boss if they'd consider sending me over to the Economist for 3 months as a sort of secondment, which is something that actually the Bank of England is very good at doing. It's very keen that the people who work for it get experience in other places and so on. And so I got sent to the Economist for 3 months, and it was an eye-opening experience. I wrote about all sorts of weird things, because when you're on secondment or when you're in an internship, you're looking for the gaps between what people write. So I remember I wrote an article about the economics of sand, which is something that I never thought even existed before, and the economics of sugar and things like that. I loved it, and there happened to be a job going here, so I ended up moving over, and for 2 years or so, I started off covering business, and then I moved across to covering the European economy, so non-Britain, the Euro area specifically. Really exciting time to be doing it. So the world economy was starting to slow. There was a personnel change at the European Central Bank, so that was a very big story to cover. And then, just as the pandemic hit, I moved over from writing to editing, which is what I do now. And it's a kind of a different job in a way. It's thinking about the sorts of areas that we should be covering, and asking, sort of commissioning people to write about them, and sort of trying to spot what the next thing is. And that's just been exhilarating and sort of weird to do during the pandemic. As you might imagine, we're all working remotely mostly, though I'm in the office today, and trying to sort of predict where the economy might go and what an interesting story might be, I think has been really interesting and fascinating. Anyway, I'll stop there. Sorry, I went on for a long time.
On the subject of interesting stories, I believe you recently interviewed the most recent Nobel Prize winner, Robert Milgram. How did that go? Paul Milgram, sorry.
That was great. I mean, just to say, I also interviewed the winners last year, and I might tell you about that in a bit, because that was also excellent. I mean, the ideas are obviously very exciting. Paul Milgram and Bob Wilson won for auction theory, and so I wouldn't say that I knew very much about auction theory, but you kind of throw yourself into it, you read as much as you can, and then to prepare for the interview. And really, I mean, we only had him for all of 2-3 minutes, I think. And it was a Zoom chat like this, and he just had this huge grin on his face, as you can imagine, like complete bliss.
And be worrying if he didn't, I mean.
Yeah, good point. It would be worrying if he didn't. You're right. He told us this story about how, he'd slept through the call because he's based in the US. I think he got called at about 2:30 in the morning. Completely slept through it, and then Bob Wilson, who happens to live across the road from him, sort of ended up knocking on his door or ringing his doorbell, and there's a little video of that, a clip of that sort of floating around on the internet, which is very interesting. And then just quickly to say, last year we interviewed Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and Michael Kramer, who won for their work on randomized control trials, and that again was just exhilarating. I mean, reading about the work that they've done and just the extent to which economics can help solve real world problems is awe-inspiring. But also, it was the first time all three of them had spoken, in our little on our little podcast, and it was just a great experience.
I mean, I must say it's great to see how economics is, even with the auction theory, which any of you who do game theory, you will find out is pretty rough, has practical real world applications. And just seeing the transition from economists being accused of physics envy to actually applying like almost engineered approaches to improving policy and economic well-being. Okay, so additionally, if I will quickly plug you, if any of you are interested in hearing more of Rachana's work, the Economist Money Talks podcast.
Yes, that's right.
Yes, I strongly recommend it.
Thank you. Can I make a plug of my own? Is that okay?
Feel free.
Just to mention that we have just started advertising for our internships over 2021. So, if anybody on this call is interested in sort of trying out what economics journalism is like, it's finance and economics journalism is like, they should definitely look up the advert and get in touch if they want to find out more.
Oh, thank you very much. So, quick discussion about the current policy environment. There's been recent discussion from the Bank of England on the proposal of negative interest rates. Such rates are seen in economies such as Japan and the European Union. What is your view on this new changed monetary policy, and what do you think will be the consequences of it on the UK?
Well, I guess we can tell what the consequences will be potentially by looking at what's happened in the euro area, for example. Rates there are minus 0.5%, so it's not really that they've gone very deeply negative, and in fact, the central bank has stopped effectively cutting the interest rate, which might tell you that there's not a huge amount of bang for your buck here. What we know is that the bankers hate it because it squeezes their lending margins. They worry that if they pass on the interest rates to households and to businesses, that people will take their money out of banks, because who wants to pay a negative interest rate? You're basically paying your bank to stash your savings there. We also know actually that the public hate it. They don't like the idea that they should be charged for having savings, even though the banks haven't actually been passing on the negative interest rates. So, the sort of experience would suggest that it's sort of had mixed results. So if you talk to the central banks, they'll say, well, our models suggest that banks have been lending, that it has had that negative interest rates have helped to stimulate the economy. Things would be much worse had we not cut interest rates. But there's sort of political consequences here, which is that people become unhappy with the central bank, and the central bank's credibility really matters. So altogether, it's kind of a mixed experience, I think, and it could well be the same if the UK were to go down that route. I mean, one thing I will say is that I think the fact that the Bank of England hasn't cut rates into negative territory so far during the pandemic tells you they have a lot of other tools at their disposal as well. So, they can do huge amounts of quantitative easing, for example, buying up lots of government bonds and company corporate bonds. The European Central Bank is doing the same. The Federal Reserve in America is doing the same. So there's a question also about which route is it better to go down. Should we cut interest rates, or should we just buy more assets? There's some research that suggests that if you cut interest rates, that has different effects. It might affect the exchange rate more. Whereas if you buy government bonds, then that keeps your longer term interest rate lower. And obviously it helps governments who need to fund their deficits at the moment. So it's sort of a mixed experience. I think that the Bank of England might say that if it were to go into negative territory, it would be good for the economy, but I don't think savers and bankers would agree.
I think particularly interesting about QE and the general environment we're in, I believe that it will always seem like an implicit assumption that eventually the bonds bought back by the government will be sold back to banks. However, we've just undergone, I believe the Fed especially has undergone additional rounds of QE, and their balance sheet just keeps increasing by the year. Is this QE like continuous buying of bonds with no selling? Will this continue to be a trend? And what do you think could cause a reversal in this process, if anything?
Well, is it a trend? It's probably here to stay for a while, I would expect. I mean, before the pandemic struck, the Federal Reserve was in the position of shrinking its balance sheet. So it was actually selling off the bonds that it had bought immediately after the financial crisis. In other words, it had stimulated after the financial crisis, and then it decided that the conditions were ripe to start tightening policy. So it's not the case that QE means never-ending buying of bonds. Obviously, that varies from economy to economy. So the US economy was healthy enough that the Federal Reserve felt that it could start taking that step. The European Central Bank, for example, never got round to really stopping purchases. When it began QE in 2015. It got to the stage of buying at a slower pace, but it never got to the stage of actually selling off the bonds that it had bought. And that's just a reflection of the fact that the economy was struggling even before the pandemic. That said, I mean, it looks likely that central banks are going to be holding on to huge quantities of bonds for a long time. It's hard to imagine really that we're going to see vast amounts of sales. I haven't looked recently, but the last time I checked, I don't think any central bank was expected to start raising interest rates for at least maybe 3, even 5 years. So this world of central banks with huge balance sheets, it really seems like it's here to stay for a while. And also, I mean, the counterpart, I suppose, in a way, is this world of governments with huge debt burdens could potentially stay for a while.
Well, that nicely segues onto the next question exactly, and sort of talking about the change in fiscal response between this crisis and the past one. Because in 2008, the government was heavily criticised for its austerity policy, cutting the support for public services, which anyone who's covered the multiplier effect may have some objections to. Whilst today we are seeing these as a help out scheme, vast sums of money directed towards workers who are out of work. Why do you think this shift has occurred? And in almost like the government's philosophy on stimulus, and how effective do you think it is working?
In terms of why the shift has occurred, I think there's 2 reasons. One is, like you say, it's the lessons of last time. And that's not just in the UK, that's actually globally and amongst the economic profession. Back in 2010, there was the worry worldwide, and also in the UK, in the US, Europe, that, and espoused by the IMF, in fact, that there was a danger in spending too much. There was a risk that markets would start to doubt the credibility of governments and the sort of the creditworthiness of governments, start to demand higher interest rates, and that would all be very dangerous for public finances. Now, I think what we've learned since that time is that cutting back on government spending is really quite damaging for the economy. The multiplier effect exists, basically. And so I think there's definitely a conviction amongst politicians, economists, that the same shouldn't happen again this time. In fact, if you look at what the IMF said a couple of weeks ago, the chief economist and the head of the fund as well, they're very anxious to stress that governments should not start withdrawing stimulus now. It's too soon. The economy is too fragile. Doing it now would sort of, would worsen the downturn. So that's one reason. I think the other reason was also just the nature of the shock this time round. It's just been so large, so unprecedented, and so it's sort of it's come from nowhere. It's seen to be a health emergency, and well, it's a health emergency, and the response is from governments is we need to make sure that the health emergency doesn't translate into a really deep economic crisis or a deep financial crisis. And so the thinking was we need to do what we can to freeze the economy in place in a way that you don't have the same sort of thinking when it's your more standard recession, if you like. You know, this time round with lockdowns, I think there was a real perception that you need to take quick action and take as much action as possible. And it's really striking with the furlough schemes that you mentioned. You know, 25-30% of the British workforce were on these schemes, which is just it's a huge number, you know. And in terms of how effective it's been, I think if you look at the labour market sorts of policies like the furlough scheme, it's really striking that I think the unemployment rate in the UK has risen slightly, but it's still 4.5%. You know, that's amazing. That's amazingly low. And there's no doubt that policies like this have helped keep incomes, kept people spending. I mean, I know people have been cautious and saving rates went up, but they've given people a sort of confidence to be able to spend. And it seems likely that without that, the economy would be in much worse shape. The question, I think, is what happens now, right? Because something that was really effective in the emergency phase could still be counterproductive for the longer you wait. For example, the furlough schemes have been really good at preserving jobs. You can contrast that with America, where the approach has been to expand the generosity of unemployment benefits. That's more preserving incomes than preserving jobs. So unemployment there has risen really sharply. Now, there's going to be a point at which in the UK, people might have to move from sectors that are shrinking to sectors that are growing. So, for example, it might be that you won't have as many restaurants, you won't have as many people working at restaurants, or you won't have as many cinemas. At some point, people are going to have to move off furlough schemes for restaurants and cinemas and find new work in areas that are growing. And so it's a tricky balance, I think, between keeping the support and gradually removing it to make sure that that sort of reallocation happens.
I think an interesting question would be, after the crisis, once if we assume a vaccine comes out, assuming everything else holds equal, one, what do you think the long-term structural consequences? So 5 years' time, what will be the ripple effects of COVID? And secondly, what sorts of data and ways of analysing that data are banks and the economists using in terms of coming up with these judgments?
Sure. So on the structural consequences, I think even if a vaccine is found, it's likely, well, first of all, who knows? You know, we're learning all the time, you know, and there's bound to be some calls that people make or the economists make that will end up being wrong. There's bound to be things that will surprise economists. I think that's something that we've learned from every recession and every crisis, that there's a huge amount that we don't really know. We can't say with confidence, but it seems likely at this point, at least, that, you know, you might see a shift from some sectors of the economy to others. So we talked, for example, about restaurants and cinemas, and habits might change. You know, people might decide that they can do more shopping online and they actually don't mind that. So even if a vaccine is available, they might just think, well, I've found a better way to shop. I'm going to do it all online. I'm not going to go to the supermarket, and so on. So you can imagine a restructuring of resources from sort of retail to digital, for example. It might be that companies automate, and having automated, decide that they don't want to hire workers in particular areas. One thing that's really struck me actually is that, as I mentioned, I'm in the office in central London today. There are shop fronts quite near the Strand that are completely that are empty. You know, couple of coffee shops that seem to have gone bust or shut down. Whereas where I live, a bit more sort of outside of central London, the high street seems a lot more. It seems to be thriving a lot more. You know, there's newer coffee shops that have opened up because people are spending more time on their local high streets than in central London. So you can imagine these sort of geographic shifts as well as sector shifts. So people moving from the centre to suburbs or to smaller cities. That's been talked about in America as well. So you could start to imagine shifts like this. I mean, we haven't talked about differences between countries quite so much. So some countries might might find that they bounce back faster from the pandemic. Other countries that rely, for example, very heavily on tourism might struggle. Areas that rely heavily on tourism might struggle. So there's a whole host of potentially quite important structural consequences we might see from the pandemic, I think. I'm sure I've forgotten a few, but I'll get on to your next question on data, which is also really interesting. So people always bash the GDP figures. You know, they come out too late. There's lots of stuff that they don't measure accurately, and particularly the rise of services, digital services. I think we know that there are some difficulties of measuring that. And especially in times of recession, during the pandemic, there's a big premium on finding out data as quickly as possible, what's happening. And I remember after the financial crisis, the big thing at the time was looking at Google search data. So what are people searching for? And I actually ended up doing a bit of work on this at the Bank of England. You know, you could correlate the number of people searching for words like unemployment or unemployment benefit with the unemployment rate, and you could build a little model to help you predict where the unemployment rate might be, because you know the search data is available in real time, and you get unemployment data with a very, very long lag. This time around, there's been lots of interest in data to do with mobility. So looking at people, you know, where people travel using sort of Google data. There's been a lot of interest in restaurant bookings, and they're certainly useful. Oh no, sorry. I knew this would happen. The lights turn off automatically.
As long as your camera doesn't go off, we're all right. So
let me just stand up. Give me 1 minute.
No worries. Technical difficulties. Hey.
Expected technical difficulties, but if I see the lights go off. Yes, we're talking about.
Also lost power due to COVID, so there's that.
We're talking about alternative data. Yes, so they've certainly I think helped given us a picture of what's going on in the economy, but it's a partial picture at best. I mean, as I talked about, it might be that you see a structural shift away from restaurant bookings and restaurant meals. So how meaningful it is looking at restaurant bookings to tell you about the state of the economy. It might, you know, if restaurant bookings are low, is that because GDP is low and people don't have enough income, or is that because people don't want to go to restaurants? In fact, they're just spending the same amount of money but on takeaways. So I think we seem to be getting more and more kind of real-time sources of data that really useful and interesting to answer very specific questions. But when it comes to giving us a broader picture of what's going on in the economy, you still need to look at a range of indicators, and it's sort of hard to see that changing, I think.
Again, I will just say, anyone who's interested in research, there's going to be plenty of econometric analysis to be done after this crisis.
Agreed.
So also just linking to the data thing, how has the Economist been using data? As I'm sure anyone who's read The Economist, you have absolutely spectacular graphs. And how does data play a role in your journalism?
It's a really good question. And it's something we've beefed up actually in recent years, as you might have noticed. We have a team of people who are dedicated to looking at data, and I think there aren't that many places that do this. I mean, the FT is also very good at data visualization, but we have visual data journalists whose job it is to come up to sort of analyze data sets and think about how we could show them. So the last page of The Economist now, just before the last page, is called the graphic detail, and that's very often sort of analysis of data-led analysis of the question. So anything from looking at, COVID-related data to Formula One drivers and how successful they are and what drives the success. It's a great way to showcase, I think, something that's really important, and it means giving journalists the time to go over the data and to do the analysis. I think for people who are numerically minded, it's a great sort of career opportunity as well. I think it's sort of spending resources on it, really, and that means hiring the right people and giving them time to look over data is really important. So that's the kind of the specialist bit, but I can tell you more about finance and economics pages specifically. We'll spend a lot of time, I and the authors of articles will spend a lot of time thinking about what the best way is to visualize the story that we want to tell, because very often it's a very big part of the story that we want to tell, and it can be very powerful. At the end of the day, you really only have 700 to 1,000 words to tell the story in a standard Economist article. So you need powerful charts to sort of beef up the point that you want to make.
What would you say about the challenges in communicating data, especially to non-technical audiences? Because I think with COVID especially, there's been a huge amount of confusions of what the numbers mean. Is it risky? What is an R value? All these questions. What specifically, what sort of rules do you guys use when making your charts to make sure the layperson can understand it?
Good question. I mean, it's something that we do try to think about a lot when we assemble the charts ourselves, but it's also just having lots of pairs of eyes looking at it. I think it's very easy. So as you all know by now, I'm an economist by training. So sometimes when I look at a chart, there are things that just seem I'm just kind of immune to. I don't see that the output gap is a very technical concept that other people might not know. So it's sort of trying to put yourself in the shoes of somebody who isn't a technical expert, but also, 3-4 people will look at the charts in isolation, separate to the article, and they will comment on it and they will ask, I don't understand what this chart shows. So there's a very high sort of burden on explaining what's going on. I really agree with you though on how data can be misinterpreted. I remember colleagues at the Bank of England, for example, writing a paper on the impact of migration on wages, and they used very sort of dry technical language to explain the impact without really saying this is quite small. They didn't want to make a judgment on the effect. Nigel Farage just took the finding and ran with it, misinterpreted. So it is really important to explain. I think it's important to sort of get beyond jargon as well. So just getting as many people to look at it who aren't experts, and using the internet as well to explain. So when we tweet things out, we'll sort of make sure that the tweets aren't misleading and that everything's sort of clearly explained. And I hope that we do a good job of that, but probably not for me to say.
I'll say. And finally, regarding your more finance position, I personally see we're on a turning point with new financial ideas developing, whether it be the rise of ESG, Robinhood, and fintech, or the substantial wealth transfer that will begin to trickle through to millennials and Gen Z in the coming years. Starting off with ESG, how important do you think it is? And is it of legitimate concern to investment funds, or is it just greenhouse gas?
There's substance to it, I would say. There's substance to it, but we have to also remember that listed firms don't account for the majority of greenhouse gases. So there's in a sense, there's a limit to what investors can do. And I think that sort of gives you some perspective, basically. It does seem like clients of asset managers, pension funds are starting to make their voices heard on wanting more sustainable investing. There's a huge amount of demand for this. And there are shareholders, there are activists that buy a share of a company and sort of litigate to stop coal plants opening up. So there's a lot of sort of power being used. There's a lot of goodwill out there. What's the sort of greenwashing element of it? Well, there isn't yet a proper standard for what counts as a green investment. There's not yet full disclosure on companies' emissions. And at the end of the day, it seems like you do need governments to take action here because, as I said, listed companies don't account for the majority of greenhouse gases. What you really need is some sort of carbon price, for example, and some way of internalizing the externalities from climate change and from sort of polluting behavior. And that, it'll be interesting to see where we get to on that and what impact COVID has on voters' desire to see more action on the climate.
I think linking back to that, sort of like the environment is such a vague term, it almost feels like we need to define clear metrics. 2 points to that. Do you think a sort of index like the Human Development Index for the environmental sustainability of companies is possible, or would that approach be too narrow and there needs to be a wide range of policies applied?
Well, I think disclosure is part of it. So I think, and standardized disclosure should be part of it. So asking companies to sort of set out their emissions in the process of the emissions that occur in the process of their production processes, so if that makes sense. But that's not the only policy I think that you need. You sort of want to encourage. I think you need to do more to encourage how consumers behave, for example. So it needs to be part of a package of measures, I think, and you also want to encourage, adaptation. So investment in more resilient technologies and sort of encouraging changing behaviour. And I think disclosure alone might not be enough.
Oh, that's fantastic. So we're going to move on to Q&A from the virtual audience now. So I'll start with the first one I read from Tommy. The lockdown measures have resulted in massive attainment gaps, such as the GCSE and A-level results day fiascos, as well as the lost teaching time for poorer students. How do you think these skill gaps will show up in the next few decades, and is there hope to mitigate these impacts?
That's a really good point. A really important point. I absolutely agree. Those skill gaps will manifest in the labour market. What you'll probably see as a result is sort of persistent inequality, because we know that your educational outturn, there's so many things bound up here, isn't there? I mean, kids from better off backgrounds will have coped through the pandemic better because their parents might have been in a position to sort of spend more resources on them. The kids who do well in school now will go on to earn more. So the gap that we see today in educational outcomes will sort of be mirrored probably in labour market outcomes. And that will just be one of the many factors, I think, that will probably lead to increase in income inequality. So we know, for example, that low-wage jobs might suffer more this time around because higher paid jobs tend to be able to be done remotely. How do you go about fixing that? Well, I guess there's a question of rethinking how education is done more broadly anyway. Should more of it involve sort of on-the-job training? Should governments be sort of encouraging upskilling in a world, if you think automation is going to take off at the same time, do you want to be training up your workforce and sort of fixing those skill gaps. And sort of governments always talk about apprenticeships and vocational training, and is there more that needs to be done there? So a lot, some economists, in fact, for the podcast this week, I interviewed somebody, a professor at MIT, and she was talking about the importance of reskilling and training the existing workforce and people coming into the workforce to be better prepared for tomorrow's jobs. So it won't be easy to sort of fix the skills gap after school and after university, but probably there's a big rethink that's needed on the education system.
I suppose linking to that education point, could it be said that potentially the almost like signaling value, like sort of the ideas like Joseph Stiglitz, and sort of one with the grade inflation that's occurring in universities, but also the grade inflation that had to occur as of the A-level fiasco scandal. In terms of the metrics that employers use to assess applicants' suitability for a job, could these metrics becoming unfit for purpose, making this specific technical skills even more of a requirement than they once were?
It's always tricky, I think, to know how to judge quality. So people rely on metrics and yardsticks that are never complete. Will it matter less? It could, I suppose I could see that happening. I mean, I think it depends on, does education adapt to, or do your exams adapt to build in your technical skills that are needed, in which case employers will carry on looking at your grades and so on. Or if it doesn't adapt, then yes, employers will look at the sort of extracurricular activities that you do and the extent to which you might have the more technical skills that they're looking for. I mean, it's hard to think of a perfect way for me to be able to gauge, or for an employer to be able to gauge the quality of an employee, and I've always railed against that because it always feels unfair. But it will be interesting to see how perceptions change, I think, after the experience of the pandemic.
So I think we just got a question that came in from Hugo. Did you find it difficult to keep your economic and moral principles true to your heart when in a heavily political competing environment such as Parliament? Are you even allowed to have a political opinion in Parliament?
That's a very good question. Well, I worked for a Labour MP, so I was allowed to have a political opinion provided it was the right political opinion. Probably if I had not been sympathetic to the Labour Party, I wouldn't have ended up doing that job. I find it hard. I did find it hard. I mean, as I sort of said, I discovered it wasn't for me, and I think it was because, I think it's somehow you're sort of more involved in the day-to-day decision making, and it's sort of, it can make you feel a bit jaded, I think, in terms of thinking about how politics works. So I suppose yes, I did find it hard. I think I prefer being one step removed, and maybe in sort of public policy or sort of covering politics. And sort of
Oh, thank you. So this question's from Lee. What do you think the effects of this pandemic would be on global fertility rates? How will the possibility of a baby boom or bust exacerbate socio-economic inequalities between different people and nations? How will the productivity levels of countries change?
That's a very good question. I think you should read this week's Economist, which I think will have a 2 or 3 page article on precisely this question. As I'm not writing it and I haven't read it, I'm not going to be able to give you a very detailed answer. But it seems that you may well see a baby boom in places where contraception is quite hard to come by, for example. So that could suggest that in poorer countries, you might see more of a baby boom. There's a lot of different forces affecting for the fertility rate and the birth rate. When economic times are bad, you might not want to, you might find couples don't want to have children, they don't feel ready to have children, they might not have work. But in addition, that could be something that is a bigger factor in richer countries. You might see a baby bust in some areas, a baby boom in others. That could, if that is the case, then that exacerbates something that we're already seeing, because we're seeing a Europe that is going to shrink drastically over the next 30 years, particularly sort of Eastern and Southern Europe, while sort of birth rates in Africa, for example, stay very high. What does it mean for productivity? Well, depends on what happens to technology, I think, as a result. So high population doesn't necessarily mean lower productivity, you could, if you see more automation and more investment in technology in richer countries, see a rise in productivity growth. There are consequences, though, potentially for poverty. GDP per capita will be lower. In the near term, it could very well exacerbate inequalities, because you've got a higher dependency ratio. You've got fewer workers to the population. So you could imagine, in the way that the pandemic has already, the gap between rich and poor countries will widen as a result.
So this next one's from Simeon. How do you think governments will approach their unprecedented, I'll move on, high levels of borrowing after the crisis? What do you think the potential political ramifications of schemes aimed to reduce these massive natural debts could be?
That's a really good question from Simeon. It's going to be something that we're going to be reading about and thinking about, I think, for a very long time. So governments have a couple of options. They could spend less, they could tax more, or they could sort of try and stoke higher inflation, because if you have higher inflation, then your debt burden in real terms comes down. Will they spend less? Well, we sort of talked about in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. There's a lesson learned, I think, that you don't want to provoke austerity too soon. You don't want to impose austerity too soon. So for a while, at least, governments will stay generous. Then there's a question of how they decide to cut back spending when they feel the timing is right. They might cut back on public services. That would be hard to do if populations are aging, for example. They might decide to tax more. So I think I read this morning, in fact, that Spain has decided that it will tax the wealthy more. Or they could run higher inflation. And this is actually something that governments opted for after the Second World War, which is the last time debt levels were this high. But this time round, the sort of setup is a bit different, because we have independent central banks. We have independent central banks. So they won't want to, their job is to keep inflation low. So there could potentially be a sort of a clash coming between central banks and governments at some point. You could imagine pressure on the framework of independent central banks coming along, because governments want to keep inflation higher than central banks do.
I think this links nicely into a question from Sam, saying, leading on from the question about changing government fiscal response, would an independent fiscal body help make sure that fiscal stimulus is appropriate?
This is a really good question. This is something I've been thinking about, actually. In the way that monetary policy was made independent, should fiscal policy be made independent? And you can sort of see, you can see why this would be a good idea, especially now, because there isn't much that monetary policy can do. Compared with previous recessions, interest rates are already low. They've bought up lots of government bonds. So really, all the action in terms of stimulus has been coming recently and needs to keep coming, probably, from government. And it's very important, and we know this from Nick Bloom's research, Nick Bloom at Stanford University. It's very important that households and businesses have an idea of where fiscal policy is going, because with that uncertainty, it's sort of difficult for them to make plans and to know at what rate the economy will grow. So there is a question about whether it's better to set fiscal policy independently, to remove politics from the equation. But it's also sort of hard to see that happening. I mean, would governments give up the power in the first place? And fiscal policy touches so much on political issues, you know, who gets benefits, you know, what is done with your tax receipts. These are sort of very important questions, I think, that relate to citizenship. And for that to be taken away from elected officials and to be done by unelected technocrats or bureaucrats, could, you know, it's sort of hard to see that, I think, happening.
Is there any global precedent of a country adopting a similar system? And also, what will politicians actually do?
Is there a global precedent? Not one that immediately comes to mind. Governments sometimes set themselves fiscal rules to say, you know, this is what we will do. They try to sort of tie their own hands to add credibility to what they're going to do. But I can't think of a precedent, to be honest. Yes, the nearest is probably to set rules and then to have an independent authority like the OBR in the UK to sort of keep an eye on what the government's doing and sort of hold it to account. But it's an interesting idea, and I wonder if it will keep coming up, actually, because fiscal policy is going to be so important.
So I think the next question is from Paul. How do you think the role of cash within the economy will change in the coming years? With the rise of card and mobile payments, companies moving businesses online during COVID and then going cashless once they reopen, plus, let me just quickly scroll down, plus progression from fintech companies like Ant Group in China. What effect do you think the lack of cash will have in society?
It's probably the case that the pandemic has sped up the rise of cashlessness. You know, we're now at a level that we would have only we might have expected to only be in 3 to 5 years' time. So things have really gone up a gear. What's the impact of that? Well, in a sense, it seems to be driven by people's changing habits and people's desire to hold less cash. So it's demand driven rather than supply driven, potentially. You know, it's not that central banks or governments are thinking we don't need to bother with printing cash, or we want to stop printing cash. It seems to be more that customers and consumers are more comfortable using cards. And the question then, I think, which is something that central banks are really thinking about quite deeply, is there a problem if all your money is intermediated through private companies? So at the moment, you know, if you have a banknote, you can go to the Bank of England, you can get a replacement, or there's something, you know, that it's state issued, and this is something that central banks and governments would say is very important. It's not about your money being issued by Lloyd's, or cash being something that you can only use on Facebook, or, you know,
they tried to,
whatever, although they have tried. So there's a question of sort of competition. You know, what if all the money becomes intermediated by the private sector, by big actors in the private sector, and they somehow use that to the disadvantage of customers? And so the way in which central banks are trying to think about that now is to think about a digital currency. So just an equivalent of a banknote, but held digitally in a digital wallet that has the same sort of properties that cash does, except it's virtual. And so I think that opens up a lot of interesting areas. You know, you asked about negative interest rates, for example. And the worry about negative interest rates is, well, I can just stash the money under my mattress. So rather than pay for my money to be stashed in a bank, I'll just take it out of the bank and keep it at home. But with a digital banknote, the negative interest rate could be applied. So all of a sudden, it starts to change the way, you know, central banks might think about monetary policy, and it's certainly something to watch, I think.
What do you think could be some good research sources for finding out more about those developments?
Good question. So
Is there an article in the works?
Well, we did have an article in July. I was hesitating to plug The Economist there, but I'm very happy to do that. We did have an article about digital currencies. China's very advanced. We've had an article on China's digital currency as digital currency plans as well. You could look at, there are speeches by the Bank for International Settlements has done a lot of work on this, actually. There's a really interesting paper talking about the various forms of money and also bringing in Bitcoin and so on. So I think it's worth looking at sort of papers and speeches by their officials if you want to get an idea on this.
Excellent. So I think we're just about coming up to time now. I think it's 3 minutes to 7. It's been absolutely fantastic having you, Rachana, and I think everyone's gained some tremendous insights. Just again, a reminder, another plug, the Marjorie Dean internship is now open, and you can apply through the Economist website.
Yes, that's right. So there's yes, you should be able to find the advertisement on the Economist website, and it means sending a covering letter and 3 ideas for articles that you think would be suitable for publication in the Economist. And if you have any questions, just do get in touch. I'm very happy to talk more about it.
Oh, thank you very much. So great turnout, great event. Hope to see you all next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers. Bye.